On Christmas Eve 1914, in the middle of World War I, German and British soldiers who had been trying to kill each other for months climbed out of their trenches, sang carols to each other across no man's land, and by Christmas Day were exchanging gifts and playing football in the mud between the lines. This didn't happen at just one spot on the map. It happened independently at dozens of points along the Western Front, documented afterward in hundreds of soldiers' letters home, war diaries, and official regimental records from both the British and German sides. It is one of the most thoroughly corroborated events of the entire war, cross-checked across multiple languages and units that had no way of coordinating with each other beforehand. By December 1914, the war that governments had promised would be over by Christmas had instead collapsed into brutal trench stalemate, with British, French, and German soldiers dug in facing each other across a narrow strip of shattered no-man's land, sometimes less than 100 yards wide. Neither high command expected what was about to happen next, and both would spend the rest of the war trying to make sure it never happened again. Trench life by December 1914 was miserable in ways governments back home barely understood. Freezing mud that could swallow a boot to the ankle, flooded dugouts that never fully drained, lice, trench foot, and constant risk of sniper fire or artillery, punctuated by brief, brutal assaults that gained almost no ground and cost thousands of lives in a single afternoon. In some sectors, the opposing trenches sat as close as 50 or 60 yards apart, close enough for soldiers on either side to hear each other coughing, joking, or singing without straining. As Christmas approached, small, unofficial signals began passing between the opposing lines. German units, many of whom had strong Christmas traditions involving decorated trees and candlelight passed down from Prince Albert's popularization of the custom decades earlier, began placing small lit Christmas trees, sent from home in supply parcels, along their trench parapets on Christmas Eve, clearly visible to British soldiers just yards away across the mud. Then came the singing. German troops began singing Christmas carols, Stille Nacht, Silent Night, sung in German, and in several places, British soldiers, recognizing the melody even without understanding the words, began singing the same carol back in English. Soldiers on both sides later described the strange, haunting experience of hearing an enemy trench harmonizing with their own across open ground where hours earlier men had been trying to kill each other, and where, days later, they would be trying to again. By the early hours of Christmas morning, in several sectors, soldiers began calling out to each other across no man's land, first cautiously, shouting simple phrases like, "Merry Christmas," to test whether it was a trap, then more openly, as it became clear neither side intended to open fire, and isolated figures began cautiously showing themselves above the parapet without being shot at. As dawn broke on Christmas Day, in dozens of separate locations along roughly two-thirds of the British-held sector of the front, soldiers from both sides began climbing out of their trenches entirely, an act that, under normal orders, would have gotten them shot instantly by their own side for reckless suicide, let alone by the enemy waiting in the opposing line. Nothing happened. No shots were fired. Soldiers met in the middle of no man's land, shook hands, and began exchanging what little they had. German soldiers offered cigars, cigarettes, and buttons or badges cut from their own uniforms as keepsakes. British soldiers offered chocolate, tinned meat, and plum puddings sent from home by families who had no idea their gifts would end up shared with the enemy. In several sectors, the truce extended to something far more solemn: joint burial parties, where soldiers from both armies worked together to recover and bury the dead who had been lying exposed in no man's land for weeks, sometimes rotting where they had fallen since earlier battles in November, and in at least one documented case near Ploegsteert Wood, conducting a shared religious service in both English and German over the graves of men who, days earlier, had been enemies trying to kill each other. And in at least a few well-documented locations, soldiers organized informal football matches in the frozen mud between the trenches, using whatever ball, sometimes an actual leather football sent from home, sometimes a bundled ration tin or a sandbag stuffed with straw, they could find, playing an improvised, muddy match against men they had orders to kill days earlier and would again within the week. British units, including the Royal Warwickshire Regiment and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, left detailed letters describing the exchanges, some soldiers even trading addresses with the Germans they had met, hoping with what now reads as heartbreaking optimism to write to each other once the war ended. The truce lasted, in most places, only through Christmas Day itself. In a small number of sectors, an informal ceasefire quietly continued for several more days into the new year, with soldiers on both sides simply declining to resume hostilities until pressured, and eventually threatened, from above. Word of the truce reached senior officers within days, and the reaction was immediate alarm rather than sentiment. British and German high commands both understood instantly what an unauthorized, spontaneous peace between enemy soldiers implied, that ordinary men on both sides, given the choice, did not particularly want to keep killing each other, a conclusion that terrified commanders whose entire strategy depended on soldiers continuing to see the men across no man's land as targets rather than people. Commanders on both sides issued urgent written orders forbidding any repeat of fraternization, explicitly threatening courts-martial for officers who allowed it to happen again under their command, and in the years that followed, artillery bombardments and coordinated trench raids were deliberately scheduled for Christmas Eve, specifically to prevent soldiers from having the quiet, undisturbed opportunity to reach out to the enemy again, the way they had in 1914. By Christmas 1915, any attempt at a similar truce was actively and violently suppressed by officers on both sides, with some units rotated out of the front line entirely over the holiday, specifically so they would have no opportunity to fraternize. The spontaneous peace of 1914 never happened again at anything close to the same scale for the remainder of the war, though isolated, small-scale, unofficial ceasefires reportedly persisted in a handful of quieter sectors in later years, never reported up the chain of command by the soldiers involved. The men who took part in the 1914 truce went back to killing each other within days, sometimes, according to several soldiers' letters, against the very men they had shaken hands with, shared cigarettes with, or played football against on Christmas morning. Several veterans interviewed decades later for oral history archives, including recordings held by London's Imperial War Museum, described the surreal, almost unbearable difficulty of resuming the war against men whose faces, and in some cases names and hometowns, they now recognized from a single morning's conversation. The war continued for nearly 4 more brutal years, eventually claiming an estimated 17 million lives across all sides combined. For decades afterward, the truce was treated by official military historians as a curious but minor footnote, an oddity rather than something worth dwelling on in accounts focused on strategy, casualties, and command decisions. It survived in public memory largely because so many individual soldiers wrote about it in personal letters home, diaries, and later memoirs, insistent on preserving a memory that official military histories had little institutional interest in emphasizing, since it undercut the narrative of implacable enmity the war effort depended on. Modern historians now regard the Christmas truce of 1914 as one of the most remarkable acts of spontaneous humanity documented in modern warfare. Not a myth softened and exaggerated by a century of retelling, but a genuinely recorded mass refusal, however brief, of tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers across dozens of independent locations to treat each other as enemies on one particular morning. Historians estimate roughly 100,000 troops took part across the length of the British-held front alone, a scale that makes it impossible to dismiss as an isolated, exaggerated anecdote from a handful of sentimental letter writers. It has since become the subject of memorials, films, including the 2005 French film Joyeux Noël, nominated for an Academy Award, and commemorative football matches played by British and German veterans' descendants and modern armed forces personnel at the actual former front lines in Belgium and France. In December 2014, on the Truce's 100th anniversary, UEFA and both nations' football associations unveiled a permanent stone memorial near Plugsteert, close to Ypres, Belgium, marking almost the exact spot where opposing soldiers are believed to have played their improvised match a century earlier. A supermarket chain in Britain also produced a widely watched television advertisement dramatizing the truce that same year, introducing the story to an entirely new generation who had never encountered it in a history classroom. No official order created the Christmas truce of 1914, and no official order could take it back once it happened. It came from thousands of ordinary soldiers independently at dozens of separate points along hundreds of miles of front, on both sides of a war they had no control over starting and little say in ending, choosing for one day to treat each other as people instead of targets. A decision made not by generals in comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines, but by privates and corporals standing knee-deep in freezing mud, who simply put down their rifles first and waited to see what would happen. High command on both sides spent the rest of the war making sure it couldn't happen again, scheduling attacks specifically to prevent it, threatening courts-martial for fraternization, rotating units out of quiet sectors over the holidays, issuing standing orders that any soldier seen communicating with the enemy be fired upon by his own side, and treating the memory of that Christmas morning as a genuine threat to military discipline rather than a moment worth repeating. It worked. The Truce of 1914 was never matched again at that scale, in that war or in any war fought since. Which is exactly why the letters home, the diaries, and the handful of surviving photographs of British and German soldiers standing together in no man's land still matter as much as they do. They are physical, dated, corroborated proof of something armies spent the next 4 years, and every war fought since, actively working to make sure never happened twice. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.